So really only the final question, am I getting anywhere near pixels? Everything else has been much more about appreciating and understanding context, and only really at that last question about the customer experience. And again, it's not the product, like it's the experience.
That's Ruby Pryor, no relation. And that's her whole approach. Understand their world before you bring yours. Their goals, their business model, their customers. Design comes last, and that's exactly why it works. Ruby's the founder of Rex, a research practice based in Bangkok. Before that, she was a management consultant advising C-suites at places like Boston Consulting Group. Then she moved into tech, into UX research at Grab, and she found that the skills she picked up on the business side were a superpower, one that most of us are never taught. Here's the moment we all recognise. You finally get time with a stakeholder who matters, but your nerves kick in, you waffle, you start selling design, and you can see them glazing over. Not because they don't rate you, because you didn't know what to ask. Welcome to In Practice. I'm Tom Pryor, Program Director at dMBA and your host. Ruby brought a whole way of working with the business side. What to understand, the questions that get you there, and how to get those conversations in the first place. By the end, you'll know how to build trust with stakeholders before you ever need to ask them for anything. Let's get into it. Ruby, welcome. So good to have you here. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm doing great. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, we're delighted to have you here. Can't wait to get into this topic. One close to my heart. I know I'm going to learn a lot, and hopefully our audience will as well. Almost certainly will. Before we jump into the tool, the framework that you're going to share today, let's start with your route in, because I think it explains the whole episode and what we're going to share today. So you sort of began in consulting and then moved into tech and UX and found a lot of the skills you'd already picked up were super valuable, suddenly a superpower that a lot of people still don't have. When did you first realize this was a gap and that everyone else kind of needed a bit of help with the thing you'd accidentally already been trained on?
Yeah, I think I started to identify more of a gap when I got my first in-house role as a UX researcher and started working more in tech itself, which was kind of quite far into my career. So I didn't have the title of UX researcher for a really long time. I think I was about 8 years into my career by the time I actually landed that title. Previously, I had worked mainly in management consulting as a sort of traditional management consultant when I lived in Australia, and then as a strategic designer when I worked at Boston Consulting Group in Singapore. So I think being a strategic designer was an interesting sort of bridge between two worlds. So I would be using a lot of human-centered design methodologies on the projects that I was working on, and these would be things like big transformation projects in financial services, for example. So I would be doing things from a kind of human-centered design lens, but I'd be working right alongside the consultants who were doing the very sort of hard-nosed MBA type thinking and work and building out the financial models and looking at the operational constraints and realities and the business model and all of these things. And I think doing that kind of work was a really good way to see how design works alongside some of these other disciplines and what potentially some of the gaps are in a design-led methodology and how it can become that much stronger when you partner it along with some of this other kind of thinking. And a lot of it was just then how I worked. It's all I'd ever really known. And so I was actually kind of quite intimidated in some ways then to go in-house. And I recognized there were real gaps in my skill set that I had to learn how to fill. And then the positive side, I guess, flip side of that coin is there were also some real strengths that I was able to bring into that kind of context and organization from my own background.
Really interesting transition. I think a bit different to how a lot of us end up in tech and UX. And yet, so today you're going to share some of those skills, tips for how to better connect between UX tech folks and those stakeholders that can be a tricky bridge to kind of cross very often. So tell us a bit more about what you're going to share today, and then I think we're going to start screen sharing and get into it.
Yeah, fantastic. So I'm going to share some of my tips for working with business stakeholders, and I guess also business-minded stakeholders. So when I say business stakeholders, generally I mean those kind of stakeholders who are not directly working on the tech product itself. So if you work inside of a big tech organization, I'm thinking particularly organizations like an Amazon or an Uber, where there's a real operational element to that organization, there will be huge numbers of people who work there who have very little to do with the product. And what they have to do with the product is not kind of updating it and changing it, but really about kind of working with a product kind of on the ground with all of their other stakeholders, or potentially with the, driver partners and things like that in the case of Uber. So all of those stakeholders, and they might have titles like operations teams, strategy teams, country teams, things like this. Those stakeholders can have really different modes of thinking, really different questions and goals in terms of how they work. And often I find that designers and researchers and UX folk can kind of limit their remit to just the tech organization. And on the one hand, this makes loads of sense if you're working on the tech product. But on the other hand, so much of your potential influence you're kind of missing out on if you are not paying attention to these huge parts of your organization that potentially could really use your thinking, your insights, and indeed probably have tons of feedback on the design of the product. So that's like the business stakeholders. But then you also have very business-minded stakeholders who work within the tech organization. And these tend to be senior people, leadership, but also product managers. They tend to really try and bridge that divide as individuals and as a discipline. And so whenever you're working with product managers, I think it's really important to show your business acumen and your understanding of some of those realities and constraints that discipline is facing as well.
Absolutely, yes. And today, I love that we're going to make it really practical, because very often we're told you need to kind of build better relationships with stakeholders, understand business stuff, but practical stuff that like you're going to share today, I think is just gold. So Ruby, let's get into it.
Today, I want to share with you a bit of a framework for the types of questions we need to grapple with when we're working with business stakeholders. So we're going to talk through three main things, which is vision and goals, business model, and customers and CVP. And then I have a few other kind of tips and tricks that we will maybe work through as part of this framework as well. And when I said earlier that when I went in-house in tech, I felt I brought a set of skills, but I also had a set of real gaps in my capability. I honestly think stakeholder management was kind of one of them. When you work in management consulting, I think particularly with some of these really big organizations like BCG, our clients were often super senior C-suite leaders. And so we had to be very, very good at managing them. But if you could get that person on side, they were then extremely capable at getting that message to kind of filter down through the whole rest of the organization. And so it meant when I went in-house and suddenly I didn't have this same kind of firepower, if you like, of having the CEO on side, I had to kind of learn how to do a lot of this from the ground up. And at the same time, when you work in consulting, you've often been given a really clear brief from a client about this is what we want to achieve, here are our goals, and these are the outcomes and the deliverables we're looking for. And that clarity doesn't always exist in-house either. So I think it took me a little while to come to terms with what it was like to be an individual contributor in a big organization and kind of find my way through these things. So this wasn't as if I turned up on day one with this amazing playbook of how to make lots of impact. I had to figure it out as I went.
Gotcha. So yeah, build those good skills, like you say, consulting. It's such an advantage to be kind of going in paid in a senior level and then that filter down. So yeah, interested to see how you adapted.
Yes, for sure. So let's start kind of at the top with vision and goals. So I think it's really important to appreciate and understand the broader context of the teams and products that you're working with. So there's three questions that I kind of have under the vision and goals. So how would you describe the goals and priorities of your team? How do these map to the organization's overarching goals? And what, if anything, stands in the way of your team achieving this goal? So I think it can be really tempting as a researcher or as a designer to sometimes really want to jump straight in. Like if you're getting your hands on the product for the first time, or you're getting your hands on a research request for the first time, you just want to deliver, you want to show that you can do something, that you have ideas and you can make changes. But I often found kind of taking a moment, taking a step back and appreciating this broader context would mean that I was actually a much more effective operator. And I think sometimes you do have to go slow to go fast. And I think these type of questions are a great example of that. And it's the duality of my mini team, like this product manager, this product versus the whole organization. And how do those two things fit together, and understanding that I think is really key to making big impact as you move forward with your career in that organization.
So putting a little bit of that enthusiasm and ego maybe just to one side, where, designers, we like to think we're at the center of the universe with things a lot of the time, but actually there's so much more context, and maybe just holding back a little bit is valuable.
Yeah. And this doesn't have to be just a conversation with somebody either. I think it's really important to get your hands on documents that lay out a lot of this stuff. So particularly strategy documents, I tend to find are the most helpful to understand these bigger questions in terms of the goal of the team, the vision for the team, and the current priorities. These are all things that should be enumerated in some kind of strategy document. And that I find is much more helpful than trying to sort your way through Jira tickets or something like that. Like, this is about appreciating and understanding the bigger picture. So we'll talk about this maybe a little bit in terms of in the tips of how you extract this information. But I think finding written documentation for these things is going to be really helpful. And under this category as well is where I would be asking questions around OKRs or KPIs, or how these things actually translate into metrics. Because at the end of the day, that's often the thing that your team is going to be assessed on, is how you hit a certain metric. So you need to know, what is it, how we're going on it now, and what the goals are around that metric.
What kind of stakeholders will you be trying to approach with these questions? And would you be doing this in a workshop or like over email? How are these questions being asked?
So when I started at Grab, I had this goal to just kind of meet as many people as possible. And I built myself like a mini CRM, which was just like a Google sheet with people's name in it, and then anything from the conversation that I wanted to make sure I recorded. And I started with my immediate team. So I was a UX researcher, and obviously I started with like my manager and my colleagues, and I would ask them, who else do I really need to meet? And I was then assigned to work on in GrabFin, which is Grab's financial products. And so that's mainly where my research efforts were focusing. So within those product teams, I was really keen to meet the designers and the PMs. And then a lot of people I would meet, I would say, who else do you recommend that I meet? And I ended up meeting some extremely senior people in the organization that honestly, I didn't even realize how influential some of these folks were, just through at the end of every call saying, who else do you really think it would be a great idea for me to meet? And it meant that I was able to build out this really great internal network, but also put together some pieces of the puzzle of how everything really mapped out. So I think at the first instance, your working team is really, really critical, but it's rarely going to hurt your career and your prospects if you can get a coffee chat in with more senior folks in your teams and organizations as well.
Okay, so it's one-to-one relationship building, bit of networking, but every time you're having that conversation, it's like, who next? How long, I'm curious, how long did you spend doing these? Was it like a few weeks, few months?
I probably did it more intensely for the first couple of weeks. And then when your workload starts ramping up, often this starts ramping down.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think if you can keep it going, it's so advantageous. I really think in our careers, we often overlook the value of internal networking. Like when people hear, I have to get out there and I have to network, they imagine going to conferences and meetups and schmoozing with business cards. But so many of the best contacts I've made in my career are people that already work inside my organization. And it's just such a no-brainer. You already have credibility because you're in together already, like you're part of a team. So don't sleep on that. It's so, so wonderful for your career more broadly, and then also for your ability to execute in your role.
Great advice. And who doesn't like to be asked, like, I really want to learn more about you and your role? Like,
exactly.
Fantastic, Ruby. That was really helpful because I was just trying to imagine like the context in which I'm asking these questions. So I'm putting myself with that cup of coffee with that stakeholder now and going through these. So fantastic. Okay, so that's vision and goals.
Let's move next to talk a little bit about business model. So I think 3 questions we really need to grapple with when it comes to business model. The first one is, help me understand the business model of your area or product. The second, what are the largest drivers of revenue or cost, and what are your goals around these? And the third, what does the competitive landscape look like? So business model, I think, is the most critical. And if you would only ask one question under this category, that's the one to ask. A business model is essentially how does your company make money, or potentially how does your product make money? Because when we talk about a big organization, for example, if you're working for Amazon, to try and break down the business model of Amazon would take you months. It is so complex, all of the different offerings, all of the different businesses. It's sort of not feasible and frankly, probably not that useful for you to understand in a lot of detail the business model of Amazon. What you need to understand is what does that look like when it comes to the area that I'm working on? And so, for example, when I worked at Grab, I said I worked to begin with on Grab's financial products. So to really build my understanding about, for example, how the rides business works or how the express delivery business works, much less of a priority. It was way more important for me to build my fluency and understanding about how the business model works of the financial products, and then specifically the financial products I was working on. So kind of zoom this in, tailor this down to the area that you're actually working on.
Absolutely co-sign that. Such an important one to get your head around. Have you ever been surprised that stakeholders that maybe aren't able to clearly answer these questions, or do you usually get an okay answer?
For sure. This can totally happen. And I think the more greenfields the space you're working in, the more likely people are to not have all the answers to this. And in my career, I've done lots of work in greenfield spaces. So I've done work, for example, like spinning up startups for big corporates, and you're starting from nothing. We're all figuring this out together. And so no one has any of the answers, and we all have to figure it out at the same time. It's probably a little more surprising if this happens to you inside of a legacy business, but you never know. Maybe that PM has just started in that team, and so they also don't have all the answers yet. And so I would really encourage folks to go about this conversation in a really collaborative way. If you get a sense that people don't have all the answers, this is not in any sense an interrogation. You want to come across as very friendly and very open, and potentially propose doing more of the detective work together so that you can try and figure it out. And question number 2 here, I also have a little symbol, I guess, which I put in when it comes to asking these questions around the largest drivers of revenue and cost. It's important to tailor these questions to what you know about the team. So different teams and different products are going to have extremely different goals when it comes to revenue and cost. So if you're working on a really growth-focused product, or potentially in a really growth-focused organization, so I'm thinking maybe like a pre-IPO startup that's all about doing this land grab, just trying to get as many users as possible, cost is probably going to be further down that list of priorities. It's all going to be talking about how can we increase our acquisition and how can we increase our revenue. And so you should probably tailor that conversation to the context and reality of the folks that you're working with. Because if you start bringing up all of this stuff around profitability, particularly from a design role, which you need to understand that it's not your primary role to manage that, it can just kind of be seen as a little bit obstructive and potentially a bit naive. So you do want to make sure you're asking smart questions that are well related to the product that you're actually working on and the broader context of the organization as well.
Great nuance there to be aware of and kind of doing your homework. So yeah, appreciate why there's the warning symbol there.
And then I think the last one on competitive landscape, I'm someone who loves thinking through analogy, and often I find I can understand things better when someone says to you, we're like the Uber of financial products or whatever. Sometimes it can just kind of unlock something. So I think the competitive landscape, it's important to know in and of itself, but I think it can also just add a lot of depth to your own understanding. And also if you're working for maybe a really like a niche industry or a newer company, and you just can't quite get your head around something, if someone says, we're doing the exact same thing as this company, but in our new market, you can just look at, well, what's that other company doing? And maybe research all about that and read content from them. And that just might, again, help give you more understanding, give you more ideas. So I think the competitive landscape is really useful to build your own understanding as an individual. I think also within this, I like to think about not just the direct competitors as in other organizations, but there's this strategy framework called Porter's 5 Forces, which I really like. And one of the elements of this framework is the threat of substitutes. And so in that, it's not just competitors. So, instead of taking Uber, you could take a Lyft, but the substitutes for something like Uber are things like public transport or walking or riding a bicycle. And that is also, I think, really useful to start to comprehend. And particularly as a designer, if you're thinking through jobs to be done, that is a really great way to start conceiving of that. Because if you can get your stakeholders talking about substitutes, it's another way into a design-led conversation, which is, well, what are our customers trying to achieve? What are their jobs to be done? But you're just shaping that kind of from a business perspective a little bit more.
Big fan of five forces. Yeah, that's one that we always go back to at dMBA as well. I think it's one that's particularly accessible for designers to get their heads around as well. So yeah, definitely take Ruby's recommendation and check that out.
Yeah, it's super good. It's one I like to use in research scoping conversations as well, because there are so many great ideas to think through to inform a discussion guide or a research brief in that framework. So yeah, agree. Big fan. Okay. And then the last one is probably the one where designers, researchers are maybe that much more comfortable talking through: customers and CVP, customer value proposition. I honestly get a little bit nervous with the term CVP because I think it's used to mean anything. So much of our language can be ambiguous and confusing. And I think customer value proposition can really be one of those things. And some products just don't really have a super clear customer value proposition. So, for example, if I've worked on a KYC flow before as part of financial services, so this is the Know Your Customer flow, which is essential in any financial services product. Customers have to verify their identity. So, for example, uploading various ID, documentation, things like this. Super, super critical flow. Does that flow in and of itself generate revenue? Like, no. Does it incur costs? Like, yeah, there are some infrastructure costs and things like this. But what is the purpose of that flow from a business is really compliance. Like, that is such an essential part of any business. But the CVP is sort of kind of confusing. You can construct one, right? But really customers just need to get it done because they need to get it done. So I think that's an example of appreciating business context, understanding how these things fit together, and appreciating that the nuance is a lot more than just, oh, this is the checkout flow. Every time someone makes it through, our business is going to make more money. Like, a lot of the products you're going to work on will have a much greater level of nuance when it comes to business model and when it comes to customer value proposition. So I think that's really important to keep in mind. The three questions I think we need to grapple with when it comes to customers. The first one is, how would you describe the value we provide to customers? The second, what feedback do you hear from customers at the moment? And do you think you have enough access to customer insights? And lastly, what do you think are the greatest issues in our customer experience and why? So really only at the final question am I getting anywhere near pixels. Everything else has been much more about appreciating and understanding context, and only really at that last question about the customer experience. And again, it's not the product, like, it's the experience. Yeah, do we start to kind of lean in a little bit more to that design stuff? And maybe question 2 is showing my researcher bias a little bit, because I'd want to understand if they need more insights, but I know tons of designers are doing the research stuff too. The customer value is obviously a really critical part of any product. And so making sure that you can understand what that value is, how it fits with other products as well, and how they deliver value. These things are really important. But I think if you have this conversation with stakeholders, showing that you are also thinking about the other elements, appreciating the other elements, will mean that you're setting yourself up to be a really trusted partner.
Yeah, and you're going into these conversations. I think historically we might have gone in going, okay, I'm new to the business and these stakeholders don't know me. I need to go in and sell design. This is the opposite kind of approach, really. You're going in as using your research head as well, right? Like, we pride ourselves on empathy being such a critical part of our practice. It's almost, Ruby, like you're applying it to the stakeholders.
Definitely. I aim to provide a great user experience when you work with me. I think that is so important. And so that means I need to appreciate your context. That means I need to meet you where you're at. I need to understand your goals, your implicit and explicit goals. Like, understanding all this stuff, appreciating this context, I think is really critical to make you a safe pair of hands, a trusted partner, and to build also that latitude to hopefully do bigger, bolder, more fun stuff in the future, I think you have to show that you appreciate that those constraints and that understanding first. But having said that, I think this is a great transition to some of my tips that I have around these
Right.
three things. And my first tip would be, it's not a discovery interview. So I think this is a trait that researchers in particular really have. I know for me, I'm really bad at helping anyone use a piece of technology. If you show me an app, you're like, oh, I can't figure out how to register for an account. I'll say, well, what do you think you should do? Really annoying because I just go into like usability testing mode straight away. And I think with a discovery interview, it is all about asking those open questions. It's very much about not inserting yourself into the process as well. You want to make sure you're being impartial, and you often are asking questions that you already have a pretty strong hypothesis that you know the answer to, but to have that really divergent interview experience, you need to not be leading participants and things like this. And I think when it comes to these kind of discussions with stakeholders, it's not a discovery interview. And when I worked in consulting, I would find that really interesting, seeing how I might instinctually approach a stakeholder conversation versus some of the consultants who are all about delivering value, even while they are learning things from the stakeholders at the same time. So I think when I say it's not a discovery interview, this changes the way you show up in this conversation in a few ways. The first one is, it's okay to posit the answer to some of these questions in the conversation itself. So I might go in and say, I'd love to understand more about the goals of this product. I've had a read of the strategy documents already, and I think my understanding is it's X, Y, and Z. Does that track with where we are right now? And so that shows that you are doing the work behind the scenes. You're not just showing up and saying, teach me, I'm a blank slate. Like, they didn't hire you because you're a blank slate. They hired you because you were this brilliant person with all of these ideas. So do your homework ahead of time and be really willing to share your ideas as you go into that. Obviously, balance it with being a really good listener, but I think show up prepared and be willing to put something out there for your stakeholder to bounce ideas off rather than keeping it all just completely open.
Really interesting reframing that I'm sure I've done this the wrong way around before. So yeah, good reminder for me.
It's a tricky one, right? Because at the same time, sometimes when you are just that really open presence, you can get such gold from people. But I have had the experience, I think, where stakeholders get a bit annoyed. They're like, why haven't you done any reading? Why haven't you tried to figure this out already? Why are you just coming in and asking me this standard stuff? Whereas you can come in with a mindset of, I want them to leave feeling excited to work with me, feeling like they've already got something of value out of our collaboration. I think that can be, that can set you up for a really good start.
Some of these people might be a little short on time, I guess. They kind of fit you in around a whole bunch of other things. So if you've come in not completely blank on it, great advice.
100%. And that, I think, tracks with my tip number 2, which is find out what you can async. And so that particularly means doing your work ahead of time, reading documents that you can find inside the company. There might even be annual reports or press releases or other kind of external documents that might provide you a really good overview of the organization. Working through some of your initial questions with an AI, I think, would be really great. Even better if it's an internal AI that actually has access to all of these documents of the organization and is being trained on them. So you can be asking these questions, testing your understanding. These things will just help you build your learning a lot faster and mean that you can have smart, interesting conversations with people. Because it's not probably that fun for a stakeholder to like go over this really basic stuff with you. It's way more fun to solve the hard problems together. And so you want to accelerate that boring part of the conversation as quickly as possible and spend your time like nutting out together a really difficult, gnarly problem so you both walk away really energized for what's next. And then lastly, I would say think carefully about who you talk to about what. So this goes to my sort of implicit goal of having a lot of these conversations is not just to learn, it's to set myself up to be the best I can be at my job. And to do that, it's a lot about showing up the right way for the right stakeholder. So if, for example, I'm meeting a super, super senior person, I want to go in with really smart questions and probably none of the 9 that are on this board. I would want them to be probably way more tailored, more concise, in the same way you think really long and hard, or you should, about at the end of a job interview when they say, so do you have any questions for us? and you want to go in with a couple of really killer questions, I think same thing here. When you're meeting a very senior person, they are often really low on time. Sure, you'll have a little bit of meet and greet and tell me about yourself. But if you can come up either with some very interesting points of view or some really interesting questions about the product, the context, the organization, I think that's going to set you up really well. On the other hand, you should have some stakeholders and some team members that are a super safe space and that you can ask all of your most fundamental questions with. So for me, I had like an amazing manager in my last job, and she was definitely that person for me that I would just go to and be like, wait, what is this product again? Why is it called that? Is it okay? Like, oh, they work in that team. Like, all of that, like really, really basic stuff. You need to find some people that you can totally jam on that with. But at the same time, when you really need to show up and show off, make sure that you're giving yourself kind of the ability to do that as well. So think really carefully and cleverly about who you ask what, because the purposes of these conversations are not just information gathering. They're about setting yourself up for a really successful run as being a designer when working on this product.
There might be a few conversations in here that maybe feel a little more high stakes. How would you decide what those like super valuable questions are going to be? Like how would you come up with those?
Yeah, I think it's not easy. I think that's kind of the whole point. So I think they'll be like built on and related to the kind of things on this board, but I think often they're going to be really tailored. So if I could design my ideal onboarding to a new product area, I would probably choose to work myself from more junior people up to more senior people. So then you're building that understanding, asking more of the kind of silly or potentially more obvious questions with more junior or working level stakeholders, and then working up to the more senior people where you can potentially be a little bit more impressive as you go into that. I mean, I know some people who will be almost like building their understanding in something like a slide deck. So then when they show up to that senior meeting, they have something already that they could even walk through with a stakeholder. That's potentially an option. You got to be careful there, because that can also be kind of annoying if they've actually been thinking about this thing and you're like, well, what about blue balloons? And they're like, no, we build green balloons in this team.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you've got to be just a little bit careful. But yeah, potentially showing up with something can be like quite fun and interesting. I think this question is just very hard to answer in the abstract, because it's all about, I think, getting to those hard hitting sort of specific questions that are the most exciting for some senior level stakeholders to jam on with you.
It would be so tantalizing. Like, I can set you up with an appointment with the CEO tomorrow. It's like, maybe hold back. I like your advice there of like ladder up, build the knowledge. Yep. Name drop some people you've already spoken to. Maybe that helps with trust as well.
Definitely. And if like the head of product A can make the intro for you as well, like, oh, I met with Ruby today. She had tons of questions and was super excited to learn more about your product. You should definitely meet with her, or like they put you all in a Slack channel together or whatever it is. Like, use people to help make those warm intros, and that can go a really long way. And also be willing to not get the meeting, I guess. Like, as we said, the senior people are super, super busy. And if you even with a warm intro, if you were talking to the CTO and like they don't have time for 2 months, I think just be willing to say like, hey, no worries, I'm here if and when. Maybe I'll reach out in a couple of months when I have some more ideas for us to talk through. But in the meantime, super excited to get started and just kind of start delivering value. So it's a fine line between being tenacious and persistent and being annoying, and be careful where that line is.
That's a really good thing to be mindful of. And I guess it comes through the reps, right? Of like knowing the culture of the company and meeting all these people, which is super valuable, and getting to the root of these questions. This is fantastic. And I can see how this would build so much trust, right? Before you're trying to get buy-in, trust to do some work, you're getting trust that you are good at building relationships. You want to understand the wider context so much more.
And it makes you better at your job. So from a research perspective, for example, some ways that this really was operationalized for me, I was doing this really a kind of big piece of work. I used to say that my speciality as a researcher was like gnarly one-word research projects. So I do research projects on trust or loyalty, like these big things that organizations grapple with that get operationalized really differently in different teams. And so when I would get a bit of latitude to do one of these really big projects, it meant I could draw in people from really different teams across the organization, and were able to craft much more interesting research projects because of that. And it meant that I could be testing products from loads of different teams to see, for example, how trust really materialized when it came to products from not just financial services, but also maybe in rides as well, because I built some of those relationships with folks in different parts of the organization. So it really can enhance your work and make the stuff you're doing a lot better. And understanding that context also just makes you so much better as a designer or a researcher, because teams often show up with what seems like a really clear brief. And only if you understand that broader context can you start to maybe pick a few holes in it to understand what actually is going to serve their needs better. And I think it made me much more of a better researcher when I could appreciate that broader context, tailor things more, push my questions further, rather than just kind of executing on a thing that was handed to me. And also initiate my own stuff and to say, actually, what I think these three teams really need is a research project that answers this question. Or as a designer, I think we could really change the way these flows work together because you have that broader context.
This has been really fantastic, Ruby. My final question to you was going to be, if designers could take one question, like the killer question to take from all of these, if they only had a quick minute. It looks like you've already got something on the board, so that might allude to that.
I do. This is my one best thing that I learned in consulting that I bring into all of the teaching and all of the work I do and my own practice is, if you only take one thing away from this whole conversation, let it be this: always share the so what of your work. So when I worked in consulting, we would go through slide by slide of the PowerPoint decks that we were making. And every time there was a chart or there was an observation or there was an insight, our job was to interrogate, what's the so what? And by this, we mean when a client sees that chart, so what? What should they do? What should they take away? What is the implication? And so I think as a researcher, this means if I'm showing you an observation, which is what's going on, and then I'm explaining to you why that is, the insight, I then need to tell you, so what? What is the implication for your business model? What is the implication for your product direction? And then you should have a recommendation, which means we should, take our product in a certain way. But the so what is really critical. And with designers, this absolutely holds. I think stakeholders can get very frustrated when a design is put in front of them without this context. So if you go away, you come up with a whole bunch of ideas and put it in front of a stakeholder. So what? What are you saying I should change? Why have you decided on this specific design direction? How is it mapping back to all these conversations we've had before and all of this context you should know about our product? So when you put a design in front of them, say what the so what is. What is the implication of your design? And what does it really mean for the way this product area needs to change?
The so what? I'm going to remember that one. Next time I'm going in without enough stuff, just like, oh, you like it? So what's? Really good way to wrap up there, Ruby. Thank you again so much for generously sharing that framework with us today. Everything you've kind of walked us through today is such an important skill set. And being that person who can cross between the design bubble and the business bubble is so valuable. And I know your part of your practice is built on teaching this. And I know you've got a couple of things that go beyond this to help people understand how they can improve their impact as UX focused, text focused. So maybe you could tell us a bit more about these and how people can find you.
Sure. So the best way to find me is on LinkedIn, and I think we'll link all of that in your show notes. I have two main offers right now that I run on the platform Maven. So one is a 3-week cohort course called Level Up the Impact of Your UX Research. And it's all about how to write more compelling deliverables. So we go through from the smallest nugget, which is the insight and how to write really good insights. Then we look at frameworks and how to create great frameworks from qualitative data. And then finally, we look at storylines, report structures, and executive summaries. And so we go through that in a 3-week cohort. Generally, it's aimed at UX researchers, but anyone who works with customer insights gets a lot out of it. And we often have a bunch of designers in that as well. And then my second offering is a 2-hour masterclass called the UX Research Impact Masterclass. The main part of that is working through an Excel spreadsheet where we actually put a dollar value on the impact UX research projects create for organizations. So we're not talking about just saying like, these are the type of metrics that UX research impacts. We actually break it down and you come out with a dollar figure at the end for these different scenarios of the type of revenue generation or like cost savings, things like this that UX research can create for organizations. So those are my two main offers. I also do coaching for folks. You can message me about this on LinkedIn at any time. More offers being developed all the time. So the best way to keep up to date is via LinkedIn.
Amazing. We will absolutely link to Ruby's LinkedIn and those things. So yeah, definitely give Ruby a follow. You can see the fantastic content that you're sharing. And yeah.
Great.
Ruby,
one more
yes,
thing.
Go for it.
I am in the process of developing a new cohort, which I think I'm going to call the Management Consulting Toolkit. I really want to bring like more of these broader skills to folks who work in tech. And so that's going to cover a week on problem solving and problem framing, how to break down an ambiguous problem, a week on thinking with numbers, so how to do some of these like market sizing, and then the most important financial metrics folks need to know. And then a final week about that kind of executive presence, storytelling, things like this. So that is under construction, release date TBC.
Yeah, keep an eye out for that. That sounds killer. Thank you again for being part of the podcast, joining us in practice. I'm sure we will do another episode at some time as
awesome.
well. I'd love to chat again. So yes, thank you again so much.
Thank you. This was awesome.
Thanks everyone. We will see you again soon. Take care.